Great. So hi, everyone. My name is Nicola, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. So thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us this evening for this seminar that has been very kindly supported by SuperValu. So this seminar is part of an AsIAm SuperValu webinar series that we've been running in partnership with SuperValu throughout 2021. So the topic tonight is autism and the law, so with a focus on your rights as an adult. So I'll very quickly introduce you to our two speakers tonight. So our first speaker is Cliona De Bhailis, and Cliona is from an organisation called Disabled Women Ireland. So Cliona is going to be speaking about the UN Convention of Human Rights, and she'll also give an overview of Disabled Women Ireland. Our second speaker then is Suzy Byrne, and Suzy is a regional service manager for the National Advocacy Service for people with disabilities. So Suzy will also be speaking about the NAS and their role supporting people to access their rights and information. Very quickly note a few things before we get started. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. So if you do have a question throughout the presentation, please feel free to pop the question into the box, and we'll try our very best to answer it in our questions and answers session at the end of the seminar. You'll notice too, we do have subtitles turned on for the seminar. So if you do want to turn them off, there is an option next to the chat box, a box that says live transcript. And in there you can select mute subtitle. So I will now pass you over to our first speaker of this evening, Cliona. So Cliona will be starting for us. So thanks again, Cliona, for joining us this evening, and feel free to start whenever you feel ready.
Thank you, Nicola. Let me just share some slides here, hopefully. Great. I hope everybody can see that.
Yeah,
I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you all this evening and to tell you a little bit about the UN CRPD and about Disabled Women Ireland. So that will be broadly the structure of my presentation. I'm going to tell you about Disabled Women Ireland first, what the organisation is about and what we do, and some kind of general information. And then I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD. And I will slip into acronyms a little bit over the course of the presentation. I will end up calling it the CRPD a couple of times, or just the convention, but usually that's the one I'm talking about. I've structured then the presentation across three main areas. So I'm going to tell you who is included or who is covered by the CRPD, what it covers or what the different topics and themes are, and how it applies in Ireland. But with a little disclaimer at the very start, because I would probably or could probably teach people have taught entire courses at universities and at different things on each of these things, delved into them, written papers and gone off on big detailed overviews. And what I'm going to give you today is just a taster. It's just a start or an introduction to it. I don't actually have time to go into them in an awful lot of detail. So I'm going to give you who is included. I'm only going to give you a sense of what is covered, a selection of a couple of articles and how it applies in Ireland, though I won't give quite the detailed attention it deserves. But I'm hopeful that after a session like today, you'll feel comfortable maybe going and reading the convention by yourself or looking for it and being able to navigate it a little bit more, or having that sort of introductory thing that you can step off from there and learn more. So in the interest of time and without further ado, who are DWI, or Disabled Women Ireland? They are an organisation, a disabled people's organisation, importantly, that represents disabled women, girls, non-binary and genderqueer people in Ireland. And I should tell you that really, although I've been a member or I've been a part of DWI, at least at a distance for a while, I've only really become a more active member or involved in the last maybe 6 months to a year. And partly, I suppose, it's COVID. It's been a blessing in terms of COVID in that some of the events have been more accessible and online for me. But it's a very welcoming organisation. They are a non-hierarchical membership organisation. And by that, we mean that although there is a steering group and an executive for the purposes of admin and governance, so the directors are Amy Hassett and Maria Laharta. They're co-directors. Their group is very much run around the basis of working groups, where people who have a particular interest in an area can come along to different working groups or events. If you feel that you identify as a disabled woman, girl, non-binary or genderqueer person, and you feel like this is a space for you, you can come along to one of the different working groups on different themes and engage with the group or different events and take as much part or as little as you feel you're able for in that particular time or space, and also take a step back at different times, which is a great, accessible and inclusive space to be in, I have to admit. The group operates, and we'll come to this in the CRPD as well, but under a very broad definition of disability. And it's one of the things that I've also found quite interesting, because in the last couple of months, we've run consultations on the CRPD, and one of the most common questions that we were asked were, am I disabled enough? Am I your people? Am I like, do I come within your definition of disability? And without a doubt, the answer was almost always, or was always, I think, yes. If you think you are disabled, if you think you might fit in, you're probably part of this group. So it's a very cross disability group. There are people in the group who identify as neurodiverse and autistic. There are people there who have physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, psychosocial disabilities, and mixtures of all of those combined and everything in between. People have come across and identify in a variety of different ways, and we try our best to meet people's access needs and make spaces accessible, including, where possible, keeping some of those working group meetings to just an hour, although that's sometimes a struggle when we get into a bit of a debate. So I've put the email for Disabled Women Ireland there on screen. They also have a website and ways to get further involved. They're across social media as well, if people are interested in hearing more about their work and what's happening. But I'm going to leave that portion of it there and move on to the heart of what we're talking about, or the main body of my presentation, which will be the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So what is the Convention? If you've never heard of it before, where did it come from, or what's the background? It's an international human rights treaty that is specifically about the rights of disabled people. And anybody who maybe did CSPE in secondary school in the last few years will have heard of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or if you were working in different spaces or come across it in different areas, you might have heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's a Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. There are lots of conventions that deal with specific areas or issues or population groups. And the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is among those. And it came about because although there was all of these other conventions in existence, and we already had one, let's say, on the rights of the child and against women and these existing things, disabled people felt that their rights weren't actually being accurately or adequately protected under them. They felt that although, of course, they had rights under each of these conventions and they applied to them, that there wasn't enough detail or the kind of specific information that applied to disabled people, that their rights were protected. And so as part of the process that happens with any of these UN treaties, groups got together, countries and associated groups got together and formed a committee to negotiate the convention. And that happened over a number of years and finished in 2006. And the important thing really about all of this and the history of it, so beyond that you might be a CRPD nerd like me and find it all very interesting, beyond that, why am I telling you this? Well, the really important part of this, and indeed the structure of the convention, is that the disabled people were central to those negotiations. And this is quite unique. It's typically countries sitting around a UN meeting space, trashing these out and their different representatives. And what was different here was that disabled people were involved. And from that came the motto that you'll see on the slide at the moment of nothing about us without us. And this very concept means that right the way through the convention, what you see rehashed and reframed are rights for disabled people that disabled people have identified as these are the things that are important to us. These are the things that we think have been lacking. These are the key pieces of detail and the areas which we weren't having given enough protection before. It's also a space that I think if you look at the convention, and any convention, you'll also realize it's a bit of a product of its time. So sometimes people can be critical of it and go, but this is missing or that is missing. But you only ever get in these spaces, the results of the people who are around the table at the time. So for example, some people say that the rights of Indigenous communities or something should be represented in more detail, and it might not be in a convention, but you only ever, the population groups are only ever evidence of what was there. So it's crucial that when we're talking about a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities, that they were at the table and they were saying this is important. But it's also crucial because this spirit of nothing about us without us has been carried through the convention since. So it's at the very heart and at the spirit of the convention, where disabled people are supposed to be at the heart of changing countries' laws and monitoring the implementation of the convention, not just when it was being written, but right the way through as they adopt it and apply it in their own countries. Who is included then in the convention is covered under Article 1, and it reads as follows. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So that, like many other articles, can be a bit of a mouthful and has a lot of what we would say probably convention speak or kind of formal legal terms in it on first glance, but then you need to kind of break it down. So if we look at the first half of that sentence, it reads that persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments. And one of the things that really strikes me on that is the broad application of it, therefore. So if we think about a lot of the previous and historical conceptualizations of disability, if we think about the wheelchair logo on the bathrooms or in the parking bays, if we think about what often people think about when they think of disability, and then we look at this, we realize that it is much, much broader. It recognizes that it's physical, mental, intellectual, and sensory. So it includes people, or could include people if they want to identify as disabled, with identify as neurodiverse, as autistic, with psychosocial disabilities or experience of the mental health system. And a lot of the time, maybe these groups felt that they weren't involved in other disabled movements or in other rooms. So I think that first point is important. And then when we look at the second half of the sentence, it says, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And this bit has been categorized and defined as basically moving the thinking from a medical model of disability that very much focus on what your condition was, what your impairment was, how we could cure it, fix it, treat it, change it around, to really looking at somebody within the society and how really it is often society or the structures around us that make those opportunities harder for us, or the structures that are in place that make things difficult to take part in broader society. So again, the common answer here can often be like people talking about, it's not, my disability is not the presence of stairs, but and these kind of things. Or excuse me, I'm not disabled by my chair, but by the presence of stairs is this quote I wanted to get there. But it can also be the way rooms are structured, the way facilities are arranged, the way other things are happened, the way society or conversations expect us to fit within certain things. I think they can all come within that. So it's very much moving from a medical idea to a social model kind of idea, or even some people would say, some academics have said, a human rights model, where we're looking at people now as members of society with rights and responsibilities, and not as the medical model idea of objects of charity or people who need to be fixed or cured. And I think that's a very important thing that goes to the heart again of the convention and influences all the rights that we're going to hear about within it. And then the next thing I suppose that's interesting to look at is what is covered. So for the purposes of this webinar and this session, I've grouped things across a number of articles, but if you were to look up the convention, they're listed out in full with each kind of article listed separately, but just I couldn't fit all 50 of them on a slide. So Articles 1 to 4 broadly talk about things like the purpose of the convention. So we had the purpose on the first slide there earlier, and the definition there that I mentioned around, who is included when we talk about persons with disabilities. And it also has broad general principles for how we understand the convention, and I'll get to those in just a moment. Then Articles 6 and 7 of the Convention talk about specific population groups. So the negotiators identified that women and children with disabilities in particular were groups that might be particularly vulnerable or face additional discrimination both by their gender or their age and the fact that they were disabled. So a combination of factors had meant that they felt they needed to be highlighted as groups within society that needed additional focus, I suppose, within the convention, and to highlight that all the human rights or the rights listed within the convention applied to them equally. And then we get to the main body, or the kind of substantive bit of it that gets into probably the more detail, or the piece that most people will be familiar with, which is Article 5 that talks about equality and non-discrimination. And then Articles 8 to 30, which set out some other specific rights. And rights across conventions are broadly grouped according to certain themes or areas. So I think what's interesting here is, for example, you'll find a title that says education or accessibility or something like that. And then it's only when you read the individual lines in the specific paragraphs underneath it do we get an insight into what we mean when we talk about a right to education or a right under the convention, or what the committee meant when they said accessibility or privacy or bodily integrity. So it covers a broad range of areas, some which you would expect that I've outlined there, education and health and those kind of things. And then other areas such as freedom of expression, access to culture, right to political participation and involvement in different groups and that type of thing. And then the final section or bit of the convention, if you will, are Articles 31 to Article 50. And they deal with more the technical elements of the convention, I suppose, and some of those other elements. And a lot of people just go, yeah, and then I kind of stopped reading at this point. It got to the terms and conditions applied, if you want. But some elements of that are particularly interesting. So there's an article there that focuses on data collection and the importance of collecting data on the experiences of disabled people, and figures as well about disaggregated on the basis of disability, on the basis of age and things like that, and experience, and how if we have that data and information we can better equip to provide services and supports and different structures and things around and make sure that people's rights are being vindicated. So do we have information, let's say, on the amount of people who are in inclusive versus segregated education, or the amount of people with access to certain types of healthcare, or who can vote or who have voted, and different arrangements. We also have a section there on reporting. So while the convention, and we'll get to this in the Irish context a little bit later, is an advocacy tool that we can use in the Irish context, the Irish state and all the states who sign up to it also have to report to a committee in Geneva about the different rights conated therein, and this sets out how they should do that, the involvement of disabled people and DPOs or disabled people's organisations. And then some other, towards the end, as I said, terms and conditions applied about what happens when you sign up, when countries sign up, and where they have to deposit documents and those kind of things. So we'll move on to the general principles then, and I won't go into them in any great detail, but just to touch on that it really gives you a sense of what the spirit of the convention is when you read the general principles. So they're listed from A to H there on the slide and include respect for inherent dignity, autonomy, and including the freedom to make one's own choices. There's a principle of non-discrimination that applies to all the other articles. Full and effective participation and inclusion in society is a principle that underpins the convention. There is a principle about respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of human diversity and humanity. Equality of opportunity for disabled people, accessibility, equality between men and women, and respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities, and respect for the right of children with disabilities to preserve their identities. And I think without even talking to you about all the other articles, you get a sense even from this about how, making sure people were included in society, that we didn't see disability as anything other than just a broader part of human diversity and humanity, that we ensured people have equality of opportunity and that spaces were accessible. Those basic principles that we can apply to all other articles and areas, and we can see how that is the very spirit of it, or maybe what, when you're looking at convention, what the other areas might mean. So those are the general principles. And now I've brought you through, I suppose, the broad background to it, or the overall kind of the structure of it, and what the sense of the rights are underneath it. And now I'm going to get into a little bit more of the substantive stuff, or the good stuff. And I'm going to talk to you about the equal recognition before the law, or legal capacity. And this is another one of those articles that cuts to the very heart of the ideas behind the convention, which are around not seeing people as objects of charity and people to be cared for, and instead seeing them as people with rights and responsibilities, and being able not only to have rights, but to act on those rights. And that goes to the very heart of Article 12, because it says that disabled people, or persons with disabilities, if we were using the language of the convention, have legal capacity on an equal basis with others. And basically, if we were to define legal capacity in simpler terms, you could say that it's the right to make decisions which have legal consequences, and to have those decisions respected by the law. And this was included because over the years, and still, and many of you may be familiar with this even in the Irish context, persons with disabilities are seen as not being able to make decisions, whether that's consenting to treatment, decisions about finances, and different things. And countries have used different mechanisms to deprive them of their right to make certain decisions. So there can be assessments of people's capacity. In some countries, it can be quite simply because you are a disabled person, your status as a disabled person, or it can be based on the outcome of your decision. You're making a decision which we think are unwise, or we don't agree with, and now we're going to question your right to make that, or we're going to take your right to make that away. And Article 12 says, no, we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't use any of these as a basis to deprive people of their rights. All disabled people or persons with disabilities have the right to make those decisions on an equal basis with others, and you should respect those under the law. But interestingly, another add-on within Article 12 recognises that we all rely on support to make decisions. So in these instances, some people may want to make support. So while many will have said, but such and such can't do that because they communicate differently, or this happened, or they have this condition, or X or Y condition, Article 12 says, well, support. Maybe what we really need here is support to make decisions. And we can't impose support on anybody, but many of us will naturally turn to different supports in life anyway to make decisions. And this says that states should recognize this support, or provide mechanisms for the support for people, and legal frameworks, so that when you go in and say talk to the bank manager, and you need or you want somebody with you in the background there to do that, you might have an agreement or something that shows this person is with me, they are my supporter, and I want them involved in this process. So that basically, instead of stripping people of their right to make decisions, we're now recognizing everybody has this right, and we're supporting them along that process. It also includes a really key shift that moves from what they call best interests, to will and preferences. So as again, over the years, we used to strip people of these rights and take them away from them, and appoint somebody else often to make that decision for them, not based on what we think the person would want, but based on what that person thought was best for them. I think they should have this surgery. I think we should spend their money in this way, or whatever the decision was. And Article 12 says, no, this should be done. If we do have to have somebody, it should be supporting you, and any support and any structures in place should be based on your will and preferences. So what you like, you don't like, what your plans are for the future, and the kind of big picture elements of this. Another article that goes to the very heart of that then, so we're moving away from decision making into something completely different, so clean slate, is Article 19, and living independently and in the community. And this article recognises all persons with disabilities have the right to live in the community and make choices around this equal to others. So states have to, under this article, take appropriate measures to ensure that people have a choice choose where they live and with whom they live, and they're not obliged to live in any particular sort of arrangement, that they have access to a range of in-home residential or other community supports, and access to a range of community services and facilities, which might be available for the general population, but that they're also accessible for persons with disabilities, and that they also respond to their needs. So to break this down a little bit, I suppose one of the main things that it challenges or that it pushes against is people having to live in certain residential settings or supported living, or whatever you want to call it, institutions or group homes or any of these things. If they want, they can choose to live somewhere else, and they should have the choice where and with whom to live. And we should be supporting people to live in the community instead of in these situations. So the state's money shouldn't be going to these places. It should be going to supporting people to live independently, but with support. And also that community services, so whether that is the local community hall, domestic violence centre, whatever the other services that are available in a town or an area that should be accessible to the general population, that they're equally available to persons with disabilities, so they can too be part of that community and live in that area. And I think that also goes back to the heart and the spirit of the convention, of it being very much about taking part in a community and being involved. So those are just two of the articles at the heart of the convention. And there have been, as I've mentioned previously, there could be and have been entire papers, LLM courses, and other things devoted to them. So I appreciate I've only just given you a snapshot of both. And I'm looking forward to more detailed questions maybe about other things and exploring them a little bit further in the Q&A. But I'm going to leave that there and move on to Ireland and the CRPD. Really briefly before I finish up. So Ireland signed the CRPD in 2007, and we've ratified it. So when a country signs a convention, they agree to the basic principles underneath it and the broad idea of it, let's say, and then they take this extra legal step when you ratify it to be bound by the terms of it and to say, okay, now I'm signing, I'm going to be legally obligated to do it. So I think before I've described this a little bit as getting engaged before you get married. So you broadly agree, there's a promise there, you say you're going to do it, and then you follow up with the legal step, which is the formal contract and is legally binding. So we did this. It took us a long time to get through that process, and we were saying that we would get all our affairs in order and get all our legislation in compliance in those years in between. And even from the two articles that I've just told you, I think we can all appreciate that they didn't do that. Or they haven't quite measured up to all of them just yet. Nor have we signed or ratified what is known as the optional protocol, which would allow us to take complaints directly to the CRPD committee. But that doesn't mean that it isn't binding on us, because we have ratified it and we do have to submit our first report to the CRPD committee. And AsIAm and DWI and others have been looking for people's feedback and information on how Ireland are living up to their expectations, because the state will submit a report that says, here's what we've been doing and here are the important things, but then the DPOs and other groups will also come together to write a shadow report that says, okay, that's what they say, and here are the other things that maybe are actually happening on the ground. And that's another really useful area, I think, for people if they want to feed into this process, and CRPD can be useful. And finally, just to touch on the fact that just due to Ireland's legal structure, we are what is known as a dualist legal system. So without getting overly technical about it, it means that while you might not be able to go into a court tomorrow morning and say, but we said this in the CRPD, now you have to do all of it. One of the things we can do is we can reference it, because it is something, as I said, that we have ratified and we have signed up for. And we can use it as a yardstick in our advocacy or as in other things to go, these are the obligations that Ireland have said that they have agreed to internationally. These are the standards that we have set, and we should be trying to meet these. We should be striving to meet these, and this is what we need to do. So that is an overview of the CRPD, and I'm very conscious of time, so I will leave it there, and we can come back maybe for questions later. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cliona. That was a very informative presentation, and you did sorry, there's a fly. You did a great job giving us a snapshot in that presentation. So thank you very much. So if anyone does have a question for Cliona, you can just pop your question in the Q&A box and we'll be coming to them at the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to pass you over now to Suzy. Suzy, you can start whenever you feel ready. Sorry, Suzy, you're on mute.
Okay,
there you go.
Yeah, you think now after 15 months, but anyway, can everybody see that the slides? That
yeah,
thanks a million.
Perfect.
That's great, and thanks very much. And Cliona, that was great presentation around the convention. And I'm going to refer a little bit to the convention, but and I want to thank AsIAm, I want to thank SuperValu for their support for this webinar and for this opportunity to speak about the work of the National Advocacy Service for People with Disabilities. So my name is Suzy Byrne and I'm the Regional Manager for the service here in Dublin. And I'm going to speak about the work of NAS, and I'm just have a little problem with my slides here. They're not moving. Let me just see if now, okay. So the National Advocacy Service for People with Disabilities is a professional independent advocacy service working with disabled people on a one-to-one basis. And our vision statement is one for a society where people with disabilities can exercise their rights with dignity, autonomy, equality, all of the things that you can say here. And behind us and what we do is the convention. So we try and put the convention into action in upholding and helping people with disabilities uphold their rights as they are outlined in the convention, but also in the laws of Ireland and in the policies of the agencies that support people with disabilities in their services, be that voluntary organisations that are funded by the HSE themselves, legal services, local authorities, all sorts of organisations. The National Advocacy Service was established, originally we were pilot projects established 16 years ago, and we came together as one national service in 2011. We were funded and supported by the Citizens Information Board. And as I said, we were a professional, independent, free, confidential service working with people on a one-to-one basis. We're independent of the HSE, so we have no HSE funding, so there's no conflict of interest in how we support people and how we're free to support people to be heard. So we have over 50 paid staff across the country, and we're underpinned by a code of practice. We have a board of management who are volunteers who oversee our work, and we have a management and supervision structure in place for the advocates. And we have a full suite of policies that underpin our work to make sure that we're providing an ethical, confidential, and a service of the highest standard. We also have a sister service, and you can see in the background there is the Patient Advocacy Service. So the Patient Advocacy Service supports people to make complaints, and this is people, anybody, you don't have to have a disability, it's any member of the public who can be supported to make a complaint about the services that they receive in an acute hospital setting. That service, the Patient Advocacy Service, was launched in 2019 and is supported by the Department of Health, and it really looks at patient safety and ensuring that patients, if they're not happy with services they receive, that they're supported to make complaints about those situations. But tonight I'm going to talk about the National Advocacy Service only and the work we do to support people with disabilities. So we're part of a family of services supported by the Citizens Information Board. Many of you would know the Citizens Information Service, MABS, the Money Advice and Budgeting Service, also the Sign Language Interpreting Service. They're all part of a family tree there of services supported by the Citizens Information Board. The Citizens Information Board were given the task of ensuring that people with disabilities received advocacy services. So it's part of their role under the Citizens Information Act of 2007. And this was the government knew that they had to have and provide a support for people with disabilities through advocacy. And that's where the National Advocacy Service came about. We are organised, you can see, 4 regions. We have a national office in Dublin. There's generally a NAS advocate in every county in Ireland, with some counties have more advocates depending on the population. But we also cross borders, and through COVID, we have continued to provide supports to people with disabilities wherever they are living. And we've been able to work remotely as well as do face-to-face work with people. So our remit is for adults aged 18 who have a disability, and we generally focus on people who might live in the community and are isolated from community services. We work and support people who communicate differently. We work with people who might be inappropriately accommodated, those who live in disability residential services, those who attend day services, those who have limited informal or natural supports, and people who need support in decision making. We'd also support people with disabilities who live in nursing homes, live in hospitals, live in homeless settings as well. So it's wherever people with disabilities are, and if they need support in somebody to advocate with them or for them, that's, you know, who we exist to support. I'm going to just cover briefly the inquiry process at the beginning so that people are aware that we have a website, advocacy.ie. We also have a national line that operates from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Monday to Friday. The phone number is there. Anybody can make an inquiry on behalf of somebody, and we have a third-party inquiry process. Of course, we protect everybody's data. And we can receive inquiries from people with disabilities, their family or friends, staff working in disability services, health services, through HSE safeguarding, advocacy groups, solicitors, legal professionals. Anybody can refer somebody. And of course, we receive referrals from people with disabilities themselves who make an inquiry about working with an advocate. The inquiry process is that we would meet or speak with the person who's referred. We'd gather information, we'd make an advocacy plan, we'd see whether it was suitable for somebody from NAS to work with them. Maybe there's somebody already that might be more appropriate, or the person might be more comfortable with. And we'd assess that, and we have an access and eligibility criteria. And of course, sometimes we have a waiting list though, so we try and prioritize cases to work with people. Now, if it isn't something that we can work on, we might signpost somebody to a more appropriate service. So that's also to say that people with disabilities can access citizens' information services themselves, MABs or other agencies. It mightn't be NAS that would help them, but most of the time when we're working with people, you know, if we're going to work with them, we'll make a plan and we'll start working on that advocacy plan together. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the highlights, and the last range of statistics we have is from 2019. So we would have opened probably it says there 569 cases in 2019, but we actually did a lot more work in terms of supporting people with signposting and information. And we had over 3,500 cases where we would have spoken with somebody to give them information or to signpost them to another organisation that might be more appropriately in helping them. If you can see there that we worked with people across all different disabilities, and we were very broad, like Cliona previously mentioned, we were broad definition of what disability is. And I suppose for the audience that are here tonight who might have an interest in autism, you can see that in 2019 that we had people who identified as autistic as 11% of our cases, but they might also have been in some of the other categories that are covered there as well. In terms of the issues that we worked in, you can see there that we dealt with the issues to do with housing, health, justice, parenting with a disability, and then with birth, family and relationships, money and tax, social welfare and education. So they're very broad categories, and just maybe to talk about some of those categories, housing included people who experienced homelessness, but it also included people who were not happy maybe where they were currently living in residential services, and maybe that they had a lack of choice in where they lived and they wanted to change, but also looked at decongregation. So that's the situation where the government are supporting people with disabilities to move out of residential services into community. We also supported people to buy their own homes. maybe they wanted to rent and they wanted to apply for social housing. So it's a very wide list, and it can be as basic as somebody who wanted to, you know, change the way in which they lived, change, you know, even to choose who lived with them or how they were supported where they lived, and to apply maybe for key worker or other supports to support them to live in their own home. Health issues, where that's again is a very wide category, and it covers supporting people maybe to communicate with medical professionals, to make complaints about services, to support people who are preparing maybe for elective surgery and wanted to talk about their treatment plan. The justice issues covers a lot of areas that Cliona mentioned about decision making. Ward of court, if somebody was being considered for wardship or somebody wanted to stop being a ward of court, so we would support people to communicate their preferences there. But we also cover things like inheritance, insurance and injury claims, family law, and also people who might be victims of crime, but also people who might have been accused of a crime and wanted support in communicating with their legal team or understanding court cases and what happens in court. The final category on this list here is parenting with a disability, which makes up quite a segment of our work, and that's to support parents who may have dealings with TUSLA and the courts around the removal of their children from their care. And we would support parents in those processes, and also support parents maybe who are deemed to be at risk, and support them in communicating with social workers and others and understanding the conversations that are taking place. So we also, we do, most of our work is casework and inquiry work, but we also use the learning from our casework to make representations on behalf of the people we work with in the form of policy submissions. And you can see some of the submissions that we made in 2019. We are also currently involved in ones to do with the new quality framework for the Mental Health Commission. And some other things we did this year was there's a new parenting support program being developed by the government, and we've made submissions on the basis of our experience of casework. I wanted to talk a little bit about upholding will and preference. Cliona mentioned earlier on this issue and the difference between best interests and will and preferences. And will and preference is really at the heart of our work. The role of the advocate is to get to know somebody, to find out what the issues they want support on, and to support their will and preference and involvement in the decision making around any particular issue that it is, and making sure that they have the information available to them to make a decision. Advocates support the person to be directly involved, and we're not the decision makers. We don't substitute decision making for somebody. We support their voice to be heard in any of the conversations or processes that are in place. We're not, it's very important that we're not influenced or compromised in carrying out what we do. You know, we're there for the person we're working with, not anybody else. And that's really important point to make, you know, and we're supporting that will and preference and not a best interest approach. There are other people whose duty it might be to work around best interest, but our role is to support the will and the preference of the person with a disability that we're working with. So we use various tools to do our work. So we want to ensure the fair process is being followed, and we'll use laws that are in place. We'll use maybe the equality legislation if somebody has been discriminated against or feels they've been discriminated against. We will help people make complaints to the Ombudsman, to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, maybe to take action you know, in the district court to apply for safety orders. All those various elements of legislation that are in place, we might support somebody with a disability to use those policies and laws that are in place in order to access their rights. I have some case studies here, and I thought they might be useful and of interest to people this evening. And the first person I wanted to talk about was Mark. And Mark was living at home with his family, and he wanted to move out of home. He had stayed at home since leaving school, and he left school early, but he wasn't involved in any and he didn't have a job, he wasn't in college, he didn't have any supports outside home, and he felt nobody was listening to him. So the GP and the hospital, actually, somebody in the hospital knew about NAS, and a family member told him then about NAS, and so what happened was that Mark worked with an advocate to make a plan about what he wanted to do with his life, and the advocate gave him information about housing, and also helped him become known to the HSE, and the HSE then made a plan to provide him with a key worker to help him make further that plan. So one of the things I wanted to say about NAS tonight that's important is that we're not somebody's key worker. We're not a lawyer, we're not a social worker. Our job is really to help somebody find out what their options are, to make decisions and to get the support that they need or want. And so in Mark's case, we supported him to become known and to say what he wanted to say to the HSE and to the local authority about what he wanted to do with his life. So he now has an outreach service that is helping him to plan his move out and also explore issues around education and training. So that was us linking Mark in and helping him become known and find out what the information was about his rights and his entitlements. Hazel was somebody who was living in a small residential service funded by the HSE, but she wasn't happy there and she felt she didn't get on with the other residents. And the staff supporting Hazel knew this, but they felt they couldn't help her because they have their own procedures in place, and they were working with everybody that was in the house, and they felt that Hazel needed somebody independent to support her. So the advocates spent time with Hazel, both inside her home, but also out in the community, speaking with Hazel, also talking to other people that knew Hazel, that Hazel was okay with us talking to, finding out what she liked and what she didn't like, what was going on in the house for her that was upsetting her. And also then what we did was that we supported Hazel to say what she wanted to happen. And one of the things that happened was that there was a change in how she was supported, that she had more one-to-one support in her home and she felt much happier after this, but also that everybody in the service knew that she wasn't happy and that things had to change. So there was progress made for Hazel, and the advocate stopped working with her, but the people that were supporting Hazel knew that they could come back to the advocate again if the situation, and Hazel became distressed again, but she was really heard in that situation for changes to be made in how she was supported where she lived. And the final case study I have this evening is about Jenny. So Jenny lived in her own home and she was autistic. She had a part-time job in the local shop. Her mum had sadly died and left money to Jenny. And Jenny's doctor was worried that she, mightn't be able to manage the money and could be at risk. And so he asked for a safeguarding report to be done, and there were meetings held, and was decided to ask if an advocate could work with Jenny independently to support her to be heard in those meetings, because sometimes at those meetings you have social workers, you have doctors, you might have Gardaí, or you might have lawyers, but very often the person with a disability doesn't have anybody independently to help them express what they wanted to happen. And Jenny wanted to remain living in her own home, but she didn't really know what to do with the money that she had received. So what the advocate did was support Jenny to have a social worker appointed to work with her and make a plan about the money. And the advocate also supported Jenny to meet with MABS and the local credit union and to seek independent legal advice, because one of the things that happens when people maybe inherit money, that their social welfare or housing benefits could be affected. So Jenny needed help in all of those areas so that she could make decisions. And she actually now has the money is safe. She's continuing in her life, and she has people that she can link in with for support. People aren't as worried about Jenny, and Jenny's not as stressed about the situation, because that was one of the things she found the whole situation and all the information and all the questions quite distressing. So the advocate was able to work with her to make the situation less stressful. So those are 3 of the cases there. I'm very happy to take any questions you might have, and just encourage you to contact NAS if you have any concerns or queries or questions. You want to talk to an advocate about the possibility maybe of working with somebody in the future. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Suzy. That was brilliant. It's so good to hear about all the great work you guys are doing over there. And I actually really did learn a lot about you guys as well. I had heard of you before, and I do signpost people there, but I didn't realize just how much you do cover. So thanks a million for joining us tonight and letting us in on that. We do have some questions coming in. If anyone has a question for Cliona or Suzy, you can just pop it into the Q&A box. Guys, are you happy for me to read them out? Is there anyone that